and welcome to this week's episode of Medisodes. This week in episode 59, we're going to be tackling something that is vital to all health services around the world and is the number one way most people in emergency situations get to hospitals. The blue flashing lights of an ambulance are well known around the world as a sign that help is coming. But how was the ambulance invented? What actually makes these such incredible life saving machines? And what sort of problems do they face in the modern era? All that and more will be covered today as we go through everything about ambulances. Now, some of you might remember we talked about ambulances a little bit before in our episode on medicine in remote locations, but today we're going to deep dive specifically into ambulances. And where else to start off than their history? Now, in the early days of human history, ambulances weren't exactly the most developed machines. In fact, in most cases, they were simply just carts used to transport people who were suffering with psychiatric problems or leprosy or other diseases. And the earliest known records of such ambulances are hammock based carts constructed around 900 AD by the Anglo Saxons. There are also evidence in the 11th century of ambulances being used during the Crusades. However, again, these were still extremely simple, either horse drawn carts or hand carried litters. The first record of ambulances properly being established for emergency services was by Isabella I of Castile in 1487, and this was for military purposes. The Spanish army at the time was well treated and attracted volunteers from across the continent, and among their benefits were the first military hospitals, or ambulancias. Although they didn't pick up soldiers during the battle, the soldiers being collected afterwards were taken to their military hospitals by these ambulance systems. Napoleon Bonaparte's army was also an advance in ambulance technologies on the battlefield, with his chief physician, Dominique Jean Laurier, designing these things called ambulance volantes. He was distressed that wounded soldiers were not picked up by the numerous ambulances until after the hostilities had ceased, so he developed a new ambulance system, settling on the design of two or four-wheeled horse-drawn wagons to transport fallen soldiers. He adapted the axle assembly on these carriages from the gun carriages of France's horse-drawn artillery, making them extremely maneuverable even on uneven terrain. And these so-called flying ambulances, not related to the modern flying ambulances using helicopters and planes, were first seen in use in 1793 and were used throughout the Napoleonic era. Civilian ambulances, on the other hand, wouldn't appear until 1832, when in London the introduction of a transport carriage for cholera patients began. Noted at the time by the Times newspaper, they said the curative process commences the instant the patient is put in the carriage. Time is saved which can be given to the care of the patient. And this underlying principle is why ambulances are still used today. They get patients to treatment faster. The first hospital-based ambulance services were based out of the Commercial Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, soon followed by similar services in New York and the Bellevue Hospital. In 1867, the City of London received 6 horse-drawn ambulances for the purpose of transporting smallpox and fever patients from their homes to a hospital. And a couple years later, in 1880, the president of the Liverpool Medical Institution suggested a horse-drawn ambulance for his city. In the late 19th century, ambulances slowly phased out the horse-drawn cart method in favor of automobiles and gasoline-powered vehicles. The first motor-powered ambulance was brought into service at the end of the 19th century in Chicago, which took the delivery of this ambulance in 1899 after being donated it by 500 prominent businessmen. This was followed in 1900 by New York City, and all these were automobile ambulances electrically powered by 2 horsepower motors on the rear axle. The British Army quickly followed in using automobile ambulances, but the first mass-produced one was manufactured in the United States by the James Cunningham Son and Company, a manufacturer of carriage and hearses. Their ambulance had a proprietary 32 horsepower combustion engine, and they were the first to use pneumatic tires on ambulances, as well as featuring electric lights and a suspended cot within the rear. Modern ambulances first reached their true form in 1952, where ambulances in Britain were restructured to be more of a mobile hospital rather than just transporting patients. This followed the Harrow and Wealdstone rail crash in 1952, where patients were unable to be treated on the scene and weren't able to be delivered to hospital in time to save them. CPR was developed and accepted as a standard for care for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and defibrillation, based in part on increasing understanding of heart arrhythmias, was introduced, as were new pharmaceuticals. During the Second World War and following, the post-war reorganisation led to the National Health Service, and because of this, there was a requirement for ambulances to be available for all those who needed them, instead of prior being assigned to just specific hospitals. As such, in cities like London, the London County Council's ambulance service was moved to a unique headquarters at Waterloo Road, and in the early 1960s, a brand new one was also built. London-wide services began in 1965, comprising of nearly 1,000 vehicles and 2,500 staff, and in the 1974 reorganisation of the National Health Service, the London Ambulance Service was transferred from the control of local government to the Regional Health Authority. Finally, in 1992, a worldwide media crisis occurred when the failure of a new computer system for the London Ambulance Service occurred. This led to long delays in dispatching ambulances and was a source of great shame for the London Ambulance Service. Now, in the 21st century, it has 8,000 staff and volunteers based across London, and other ambulance services around the world are similarly modernised, having services across the world and across their own cities. Having services across their own cities, and which are very similar to other ambulance services across the world. But why are these ambulances so important? Well, as I said earlier, there's a growing focus on moving away from just delivering patients to hospital to also providing on-site care. And to talk more about what ambulances can do now with their modern technology on the site of this accident itself, I'm going to pass over to Shrey.
So, ambulances are expensive bits of kit, costing over £70,000. However, the actual van or pickup truck that they're usually based on only costs between 20 and 30 grand. So, what is all this equipment that's costing so much money, and is what the ambulance is used that allows the ambulance to be a hospital on wheels? So, firstly, we've got to remember that it's not just the equipment, it's the paramedics inside the ambulance, which are really important. So, they have 3 years of training to become a paramedic, and they're trained to deal with emergency situations where they have to stabilize the patient and then transport them to hospital. Obviously, they also need advanced driver training and also things like that because ambulances are usually exempt from the usual traffic laws. They need to make sure that they're safely off driving, being able to drive the ambulance. Um, Although they are trained medical professionals, they can't usually give treatments that break the skin. That's usually reserved for when the patient gets to hospital. When a paramedic gets to the scene of an emergency, the first thing they'll probably grab is the jump bag. And this is a fairly medium-sized bag, which carries all their medical supplies and basic life support and trauma kits that you need, such as bandages, drips, medications, syringes, that kind of thing. And that would be the first thing they'd take to the site of an emergency. They'd also carry a bag valve mask. And this is basically if the patient is struggling to breathe, the bag valve mask can provide a steady flow of oxygen to the lungs. And it's important that the ambulance has a variety of sizes because it's very important that these masks are a good fit and that they have an air seal around the nose and mouth to make sure they're working properly. If there's fluid blocking the airways, they can use a suction unit, which basically a suction tube is put down the windpipe, and that basically gently removes the fluid that might have been building up in the lungs, and that allows the air to get to the alveoli in the lungs, the little air sacs, and that means that blood can be oxygenated. Um, in a major trauma incident, you might have seen trauma or spinal board. So usually the patient, if they've got a spinal injury or they've dislocated one of the spinal discs, they'll be strapped to these boards, which are like flat, not padded at all. And what it does is it basically keeps the spine in place uh, while the ambulance is moving to make sure that as in spinal injuries, you really don't want anything to be jiggled about at all. So that's really important in making sure that everything stays in the right place until you can get to hospital, and then you can start to operate on the spine or do whatever surgery you need to do. To help with that, you also have a scoop stretcher, and that's to help you pick people up from the floor and put them onto the spinal board. Paramedics might also use lightweight head immobilizers to make sure the head isn't moving about, and also a cervical collar, um, which is basically a neck brace made of an inflexible frame, and it's tightened with Velcro straps to adjust it. Now, some of the other things is obviously a medication bag is really important. Um, Paramedics have to carry a number of different life-saving and pain-relieving medications, such as anesthetic, IV fluids for patients with shock and or dehydration, anti-seizure medication, um, adrenaline. Adrenaline can be injected to reverse low blood pressure, or if the patient's having an allergic reaction, that can be really important. Adrenaline and salbutamol that we talked about a couple of episodes ago in the respiratory system can be used to open airways, and that can be really important to make sure that oxygen is getting into and the patient's able to breathe properly. And also nitroglycerine, which if you're having chest pains caused by angina, that can be really important medication for that. So also the ECG, there'll be an ECG monitor with a defibrillator. So if the patient has had a heart attack or if they have chest pain, usually an ECG will be connected to their heart to see what's going on and look for arrhythmias. We talked about all these issues in previous episodes. And if they think that there's an arrhythmia or the heart is not beating properly, they can deliver a shock with a defibrillator. So you may have seen defibrillators in medical soap dramas, and it's important to note that a defibrillator doesn't actually restart the heart. It delivers a shock to the heart, which stops the atrial fibrillation, and then you need to use CPR to restart the heart again. Um, Inside the ambulance, there's also going to be ventilators. Obviously, ventilators are big bits of kit. Um, and what they if the patient is really struggling to breathe, they can mechanically push air into the lungs, and you can basically manually control the breathing of that person if their lungs aren't being able to breathe properly. You also, for people with diabetes, it's really important to have a blood glucose monitor there to see, especially if they've collapsed or had a loss of consciousness. They might have gone into hyperglycemia, which is low blood sugar. And in that case, you'd have to give them something with loads of sugar in it to try and bring their blood glucose up. But similarly, if they were hyperglycemic, then where they had too much blood glucose, you want to deliver insulin to try and reduce those blood glucose levels. Other general equipment includes stethoscopes, sphygmometers, which are to measure blood pressure, thermometers, torches, which are especially useful if you're in the dark, blankets, which is extremely important if the patient has hypothermia, and also a medical tape and other miscellaneous equipment. So I hope that gives you an idea of how much equipment there is in an ambulance. But although ambulances are obviously really useful, there are obviously some problems with them. And Adrian is now going to discuss some of those problems.
So, the ambulance service is an absolutely essential part of emergency healthcare, often delivering life-saving treatment in a short period of time. It is very well equipped and adapted to serving this purpose, but it is not without its problems, limitations, and challenges. I will now discuss some of the challenges faced by the ambulance service today. The first challenge facing the ambulance service is the sustained increase in demand over recent years. Between February and August 2021, almost 60% more 999 calls were answered by ambulance services nationally. Calls for the most serious conditions, such as heart attacks, rose by 51% throughout this period, placing significant pressures on already stressed ambulance services. It is not only 999 calls that are answered by the ambulance services. Many ambulance services are also responsible for 111 calls, which increased 54% between February and July 2021. This indicates that there are significant pressures on the NHS as a whole as opposed to just ambulance services. Furthermore, an ambulance is not just a ride to the nearest hospital. There are several skilled clinicians on board that are specialised in providing rapid on-site treatment for these situations. As one part of the NHS experiences demand, the pressure is diverted to other parts, and this may involve an ambulance being needed to transfer said patient from hospital to hospital. Waits of over 60 minutes to hand over patients at hospitals increased by 285% between February and August 2021, causing delays that are harmful to the patients and those in the community who require the services of an ambulance. Cost is another challenge that the National Ambulance is facing, and this is linked to unnecessary ambulance service usage. In the UK, each 999 emergency call costs about £7, £180 if an ambulance is sent to treat a patient, and £233 if the patient is brought to the emergency department. A study of 300 consecutive emergency ambulance arrivals to an accident and emergency department in London found that only 54% of the patients legitimately needed an ambulance. This puts extra strain on the ambulance service. Not only is it money that is wasted on these calls, it means that the responder may be later in getting back to another waiting call, which may be about a real emergency situation. To avoid such wastage, education is important. Instead of just educating people that 999 is the number to call in an emergency, as is the case for most people now, it would be beneficial to educate them as to what constitutes an emergency situation. This would help people recognise whether their situation is an emergency or not, and this makes them less likely to call 999 if it is not. This helps reduce the load on an ambulance service, and allows them to reach people who are truly in an emergency situation sooner. The public perception of what the ambulance service is for must change. The final key issue that I will discuss is the challenges faced when travelling. Most ambulances travel using roads. A road rule is that all road vehicles must give way for any emergency vehicle with its sirens on, including the ambulance but also police. However, in times of heavy traffic jams, it is not always possible for cars to move out of the way for an ambulance to move through. There's often not enough space, and even if some cars are able to move through, the ambulance will get stuck sooner on. This issue is most common in large cities, such as central London, where the roads are far too small to accommodate the heavy volumes of traffic, and during busy hours in other places, especially those around 9 AM and 5 PM. This problem can be avoided by ambulances trying to avoid these roads with heavy traffic, but this isn't possible all the time, and having to resort to other roads may increase the time it takes for the ambulance to get to the destination. In more extreme cases of acute emergency, the ambulance service may resort to air ambulances. Air ambulances do not face the same traffic issues as road ambulances, but they are significantly more costly, which prevents them from being used all the time. So I've discussed some of the key challenges faced by the ambulance service today. I'll now hand back to Anupam.
Through this episode, you've learned a lot more about what it takes for an ambulance service to work and why they're such a necessary part of the healthcare systems around the world. And also, hopefully, you've learned a lot more about what the ambulance actually does when it gets to the scene of an accident and how the paramedics inside use all the tools available to them to help. As always, thank you for watching this week's video. We upload videos every Friday, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on notifications. And maybe check out some of our older videos that you might be interested in. As always, thank you for watching, and goodbye.